My name is Marvette Holloway, and if you stay with me through this story, you'll understand why a mother's silence can be more dangerous than her words. I raised one daughter, my only child, and her name is Talia. For years, I thought the bond between us was unshakable. I had been there through her scraped knees, her heartbreaks, her graduations. I stood by her even when others turned their backs. That's why nothing prepared me for the moment my phone rang 1 week before her wedding, and I heard her voice cold as ice. "Mom," she said, "you embarrass me. You're not coming to my wedding." I froze in place, clutching the phone so tightly my fingers went numb. The room felt like it collapsed in on itself. I wanted to believe I had misheard her, that maybe she was joking, maybe stress had made her lash out. But no, she repeated it clearly with the certainty of someone cutting off a limb they no longer wanted. I sat in stunned silence as she explained that her fiancé's family had expectations, that she couldn't risk me being there, that my presence would ruin the day she had been dreaming of. When the call ended, I sat in my chair for what felt like hours, staring into the stillness of my house. The clock ticked loudly on the wall, mocking me with every second. Outside, life carried on, neighbors mowing their lawns, children playing down the street, a delivery truck passing by. The world moved, but mine had stopped. I whispered to myself. After everything I gave, and still, it wasn't enough. You see, I don't know if you've ever been told by your own child that you are an embarrassment. But if you have, you understand the kind of wound it leaves. It isn't like a cut on the hand or a bruise on the arm. It's deeper. It's the kind of wound that carves into your soul, reminding you that the very person you poured your life into now sees you as disposable. That day, humiliation became my closest companion. And before I take you deeper into this story, I want to know something. Where are you watching from tonight? Because I need you right here with me, sitting across from me, as I walk you step by step through what happened next. I need you to feel this the way I felt it. Because what started as the worst day of my life turned into something else entirely. I remember going to bed that night, unable to sleep. I replayed her words over and over. "You embarrass me." My daughter, the girl I carried, the girl I sacrificed for, the girl I had once defended when no one else would, now saw me as a stain. My chest ached, like someone had set a weight on it. I thought of all the moments when she was little, when she used to reach for my hand at the store or crawl into my bed after nightmares. Where did that little girl go? By morning, I couldn't even bring myself to eat. I stayed in the house, blinds half drawn, phone silent on the counter. Neighbors probably thought I was just tired, but inside, I was breaking, and yet there was something else forming too, a kind of quiet anger. A spark. I didn't know it yet, but that spark would grow into something much larger, something she never expected. I'll tell you this much. That wedding she banned me from, the one she thought she could erase me from, the one she wanted to be her perfect new beginning, it would not end the way she planned. There are certain memories you try to bury so deep that you pray they'll never resurface. But no matter how far you run from them, they sit in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to step back into the light. For me, that moment came decades later, long after I thought I had moved on. When I was in college, I was sick. Not the kind of sick you can walk off with an aspirin or sleep away with a nap. It was the kind of sickness that left you weak, drained and unable to keep up with the demands of a job and classes. I had been balancing both, trying to hold my life together with string and tape. But when my body gave out, my bank account followed. I had to make choices no young woman should ever have to make. I remember standing in the aisles of a small corner store one evening, dizzy from hunger, my stomach turning with knots. I hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days. I looked down at a pack of bread and a carton of milk, things so small and ordinary, but in that moment, they felt like lifelines. I picked them up with shaking hands and told myself I'd come back and pay for them when I had the money. But deep down, I knew I didn't know when that would be. I slipped them into my bag, trying to act casual, trying to keep my hands steady. But when I turned to leave, I felt a hand clamp down on my arm. The store manager had seen me. I can still hear the shame in his voice when he said, "You think I wouldn't notice?" My legs buckled. I was marched to the back office, bread and milk pulled from my bag, and my heart pounding so hard I thought it might stop. The police were called. Yes, over a few dollars worth of food. I sat there, a 20-year-old girl, head hanging low as if the whole world had stopped to watch me drown. When the officer looked me over, he must have seen the sickness in my face, the hollow in my cheeks, because in the end, they let me go with a warning. No charges stuck, but that didn't matter. The whispers had already begun. In that small college town, people didn't forget. They didn't care about the context or the hunger or the sickness. They cared about the scandal. Marvette Holloway was caught stealing. That became the headline of my life for months. I thought time would bury it, that eventually people would move on and forget. I told myself I'd outrun it with hard work, with grace, with building a new life. And for a while, it felt like I did. But then came Talia, my beautiful daughter, my pride. And one day, when she was a teenager, she found out. She stumbled across that story, that stain on my past. I tried to explain. I tried to make her understand that I wasn't a thief. I was just a young woman trying to survive. I told her that desperation makes people do things they would never imagine otherwise. But her eyes were cold, and her silence told me everything. To her, I was not a survivor. I was a woman who had once been caught stealing. That discovery changed something between us. She carried it with her, quietly, like a secret weapon. Anytime we argued, I could see it flicker in her eyes. I know who you really are. My daughter never forgave me for that mistake, even as I built a stable life, even as I raised her alone with honesty and hard work. It was as if my one fall erased all the years I stood tall. And then, as if her judgment wasn't enough, her fiancé's family, the Whitfords, dug into my past too. Conrad and Estelle, with their wealth and their private investigators, unearthed that old record. To them, it wasn't just gossip. It was ammunition. They looked at me like a stain that could never be washed out. In their eyes, I was unfit to stand beside their son, unfit to be seen at their carefully polished wedding. That was the final cut. My past, the one I had tried to bury, had been dragged back into the light, and it became the very reason I was locked out of my daughter's life at the moment she should have wanted me most. I wish I could tell you that my daughter came to her own conclusion about me, that she weighed everything I had done for her against that one mistake in my past and still chose rejection. But the truth is, she didn't stand alone in that judgment. She had help. The Whitfords, Conrad, and Estelle were the kind of people who wore their money like a second skin. Old money, polished accents, the kind of couple who sat on boards, and whose names carried weight in every social circle. When they looked at me, I felt their eyes sweep over every thread of my clothing, every line on my face, every shadow of my history. They didn't have to say much. Their silence was sharp enough. The first time I met them, they smiled with their lips, but not with their eyes. You know that kind of smile, the one that tells you they've already decided who you are before you even open your mouth. Estelle leaned in close to Talia that day, her hand brushing against her daughter's arm like she was drawing her away from me. Conrad barely looked in my direction, except when I spoke, and then he'd tilt his head, studying me as though I was a puzzle piece from the wrong box. They knew. I could see it in the way Estelle pursed her lips when the conversation turned to family, in the way Conrad adjusted his cufflinks when I mentioned my years working at the library. They had dug up my past, and though no one uttered the words out loud, the message was clear. We know about the theft. We know who you are, and you will never be one of us. Talia saw that judgment, and instead of shielding me from it, she absorbed it. My daughter, the little girl I once held through thunderstorms, began to look at me through their eyes. Every time she introduced me to someone new, I could hear the hesitation in her voice. Every time I offered advice about her wedding plans, she recoiled as if my words might leave stains on the white dress she wanted to wear. It wasn't long before she started calling me a liability, a word she must have picked up from them. Mom, you just don't understand. People like them, they notice everything. You don't get it. You'd ruin things. Imagine hearing your child say that. Not that you don't belong. Not that you've made mistakes, but that your very presence is a threat to the life she wants to build. It cut deeper than the whispers in that college town, deeper than the humiliation of being caught with bread and milk decades ago. This wasn't a stranger's judgment. This was my daughter's contempt, carved into me with their wealth as the blade. I sat through dinners where the Whitfords smiled at Talia like she was already theirs, as if she had been adopted into their world, and I had been left behind. And Talia, my Talia, beamed under their approval, her laughter brighter with them than it ever was with me. She wanted what they had. She wanted it so badly that she was willing to erase me to get it. So when that phone call came, "You embarrass me. You're not coming to my wedding," it finally made sense. It wasn't just her voice on the other end of that line. It was theirs too. Conrad's cold disdain, Estelle's pursed lips, and all of Talia's desperate hunger to belong to them. That call was a chorus, and I was the only one cut out of the song. Humiliation settled into my chest like a stone I couldn't move. I thought that was the end of it, that the worst had already come, but I was wrong, because a few days later, I opened my mailbox, and what I found inside would turn humiliation into something else entirely. It was 3 days after the phone call that broke me, the one where my daughter told me I was an embarrassment. I hadn't left the house much since. I ate in silence, slept in silence, sat in silence. The quiet had weight to it, like a thick fog pressing against the walls. But that evening, just before the sun went down, I forced myself outside. The air was heavy and still, cicadas buzzing in the distance, the world going about its business as if my heart hadn't been ripped out. I walked down the path to my mailbox, a walk I had made hundreds of times, never expecting anything more than bills and advertisements. I remember the way the metal door creaked when I opened it, how ordinary the moment seemed. But tucked inside was an envelope, thick, bulging, heavier than anything else in there. At first, I thought it was another catalog, or maybe some legal notice meant for a neighbor. I glanced at the label, and that's when I realized it wasn't for me. The name printed neatly across the front was that of the Whitfords' wedding planner. My chest tightened. What would something like that be doing in my box? My street wasn't far from theirs, but still, this wasn't the kind of mail that usually got mixed up. I turned it over in my hands, weighing it, debating whether to open it. But curiosity, no, not curiosity, instinct pressed me to look inside. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out a stack of papers thicker than my Bible. The first thing I saw was a set of contracts, the venue, the catering, the flowers, the kind of paperwork that spelled out the perfect day my daughter had chosen to erase me from. I almost shoved it all back into the envelope, thinking it would only deepen the wound. But then, in the middle of the stack, a different kind of document caught my eye. A prenuptial agreement. My breath stopped. I read line after line, my fingers trembling as the words cut into me. If Talia divorced Darien before 5 years had passed, she would walk away with nothing. Nothing. No protection, no compensation, no acknowledgement of the years she would give up for him. It was a trap, and she had walked right into it. My daughter had sold her future for the approval of people who already despised me, and who, I now realized, didn't care about her either. But the prenup was just the beginning. The next set of papers were bank statements. At first, the numbers blurred before my eyes. But as I read, the truth settled like poison in my stomach. Darien had been sending money, large sums, regular payments, to another woman. Each transaction was clean, deliberate, documented. He was supporting someone else. And from the looks of it, that relationship hadn't ended when he got engaged to my daughter. And then came the photographs. Tucked between receipts and signatures, glossy images stared back at me. Darien at parties, arm around women I had never seen, his face too close, his smile too careless. They weren't innocent pictures. They were proof. Proof that the man Talia had chosen over her own mother was already betraying her. The final blow was almost too much to believe. A marriage license application, dated just 6 months earlier, with Darien's name written neatly alongside another woman's. He had been preparing to marry someone else not long before slipping a ring onto Talia's finger. My daughter thought she had caught the prize, but the truth was she was just another name in a line he had already started. I sat at my kitchen table with the papers spread out before me, my hands pressed against the wood to steady myself. I thought about the phone call, about her voice telling me I embarrassed her, and I felt something shift deep inside me. The humiliation that had sat like a stone in my chest cracked open, and in its place grew a sharp, cold clarity. The moment I saw what was in that packet, I knew I had been handed the sharpest knife for revenge, and I wasn't going to waste it. I sat at that table staring at the thick stack of legal pages, my fingertips brushing over each one as though touching them would make it less real. My eyes kept going back to the same section, the part of the prenuptial agreement that spelled out, in the coldest possible words, the cost of my daughter's choices. If this marriage shall dissolve within 5 years of its commencement, the spouse, Miss Talia Holloway, shall receive no alimony, no financial settlement, and no division of property. She shall forfeit any claim to assets belonging to the Whitford family or Mr. Darien Whitford. Those words stared back at me like knives. My throat tightened, and I read them again, slowly letting each one sink into me. 5 years. That was the price she had agreed to. For 5 years. She would be bound to him, no matter what came, no matter how he treated her, no matter what secrets he kept. And if she walked away before that invisible clock ran out, she would leave with nothing but the clothes on her back. This wasn't a marriage built on love. It was a contract built on power, a leash, and my daughter had put her own neck in it. I tried to imagine the conversation that led to her signature. Did she hesitate? Did she ask questions? Or did she sit there smiling, nodding, desperate to prove that she was willing to play their game? I knew Talia's hunger to belong, her obsession with being good enough for people who never deserved her loyalty. I could see her sitting across from Darian's lawyer, pen in hand, convincing herself that this was normal, that this was how marriages were done among people of wealth. But normal? No, this was never normal. This was control. And that's when the anger began to rise inside me. Not just anger at Darian or at the Whitfords, but at my daughter too, because she hadn't told me. She had kept this hidden, just as she had hidden her contempt for me until the day she finally let it slip over the phone. You embarrass me. Those words came back to me now, laced with irony. She thought I was the embarrassment, but here she was, signing away her entire future for a last name. I picked up the prenup and read deeper. Every clause was designed to protect him, to shield his family's money, to make sure Talia would always be the one at risk. If Darian cheated, if he lied, if he dragged her through hell, she'd still have to endure for 5 years before she could leave with even a shred of dignity. And if she couldn't endure it, if she broke, she'd walk away with nothing. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from fury. My daughter had been tricked into believing this was a fair exchange. Her love, her loyalty, her youth for his name and his wealth. But this wasn't an exchange. It was a theft of her independence, her power, her freedom. And the Whitfords knew exactly what they were doing. I could almost see Conrad and Estelle watching her sign, their lips curved in approval. They didn't just want to keep me out of their family. They wanted to make sure my daughter was locked into theirs with chains. And Talia, so eager to rise above the shadow of my past, had walked into their trap with her eyes wide open. I leaned back in my chair. The pages of that prenup spread out before me. My chest was heavy, but my mind was clear. For the first time since the band call, I didn't feel powerless. I felt something else. I felt like I had been handed the blueprint to my daughter's destruction, and maybe, just maybe, to my revenge. But this was only one piece of the puzzle. I lowered my voice now, as if leaning in closer to you, as if whispering so no one else could hear. This prenup was just the beginning. I hadn't even shown you the worst yet. The prenup alone would have been enough to keep me awake at night. But that wasn't all the packet held. No, the deeper I dug, the darker the truth became. The next stack of papers looked like ordinary bank records at first, transfers, balances, deposits. I almost skimmed past them until I noticed the pattern. The same name appeared again and again on the outgoing payments. Regular, consistent, the kind of monthly transfers you make when you're not just helping someone out, but supporting them. My pulse quickened as I traced the trail. This wasn't family. This wasn't charity. This was another woman. Darian was keeping someone else afloat. Thousands of dollars sent to an address that wasn't his, wasn't Talia's, wasn't tied to any joint account. Every payment logged, neatly, like clockwork. This wasn't a fling. It was a commitment, a hidden second life buried in numbers on a page. I felt my stomach churn as I flipped to the next set of documents. A marriage license application, dated just 6 months earlier, filled out in Darian's handwriting. His name sat neatly beside another woman's. 6 months before he proposed to my daughter, he was ready to marry someone else. I pressed the paper flat against the table, reading the date again and again, as though it might change if I stared long enough. But it didn't. The truth was right there in ink and signature. My daughter thought she was entering a fairy tale. She thought Darian had chosen her, lifted her up into a new world. But to him, she was just another option on a list he had already started checking off. He could sign one license, rip it up, and sign another without a second thought. And then came the photographs. They were glossy, some slightly bent at the corners, tucked between receipts, as though someone had slipped them in at the last minute. I spread them out across the table, my breath catching with each new face. There he was, Darian, grinning wide, drinks in hand, arms slung around women I had never seen before. Women leaning into him, their smiles careless, their bodies pressed too close. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't cautious. He was reckless. He lived like there would never be consequences. I remember staring at one picture in particular. Darian with his tie loose, his face flushed, lips too close to a woman who wasn't my daughter. His eyes glistened with arrogance, the same look I had seen when he first shook my hand at dinner, the same smirk that told me he thought he could charm his way through anything. And suddenly, everything clicked. The prenup, the payments, the license, the photos. Darian wasn't preparing to love my daughter. He was preparing to use her, to lock her in, strip her of power, and then live his life however he pleased while she smiled through it. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping against the floor, the papers spread before me like evidence in a trial. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from something sharper. Clarity. I looked at all of it and thought about the phone call. You embarrass me. You're not coming. Those words burned again in my ears. She wanted me gone because of my past, because of one mistake I made decades ago. Yet here was her perfect man, wrapped in lies, drowning in secrets, betraying her before she had even walked down the aisle. I had a choice to make. I could stay silent, let her walk blindly into ruin, let the Whitfords smile while she signed her life away. Or I could step in, and I chose revenge. The night I laid those papers out across my table, I stopped being the woman sitting alone in shame. I stopped being the mother who had been told she was an embarrassment. I became something else entirely, deliberate, focused, patient. I gathered every page carefully, stacking them in order, smoothing out the edges, as if I were building a weapon piece by piece. Because that's exactly what I was doing. Those papers were not just contracts and receipts. They were ammunition, and I was the only one who knew how to use them. I didn't rush. I didn't scream. I didn't storm into my daughter's house to wave the evidence in her face. No, rage is noisy, but revenge is quiet. And I knew this had to be quiet. I made copies. Each page slid through my old home printer, spitting out fresh sheets that I tucked neatly into plain envelopes. No handwriting that could be traced, no personal notes, no fingerprints that mattered. Just the truth, naked and undeniable. I started with the officiant. After all, what good is a wedding if the one marrying you is questioning whether it should even happen? Into the envelope went the prenup, the prior license, and a photograph or two. Enough to plant doubt, not enough to overwhelm. Then came Estelle and Conrad. Oh, I wanted them to see it all. I wanted those smug smiles to falter, those approving nods to freeze when they realized their precious son wasn't just protecting wealth. He was burying secrets. Into their envelope went the bank transfers, the photos, and the license. They would understand exactly what kind of man they had raised. The maid of honor was next. Talia trusted her most, confided in her more than anyone else. She needed to see the prenup, every clause, every trap. She needed to understand what her best friend had signed away. Into her envelope it went, along with a polite but pointed note typed on plain paper. Make sure she reads this before she says, I do. The wedding planner got her share too. Why? Because chaos isn't just about truth. It's about timing. If the planner wavered, if she hesitated, if she whispered doubts to the right people, the whole event would begin to wobble before it even started. And then, the final touch, the ex-lover. Her name and address had been tucked away in the financial statements, tied to those steady payments. I didn't need to embellish. I didn't need to beg. I just slipped a copy of the transfers and one of the photographs into an envelope and mailed it off. A woman betrayed doesn't need instructions. She'll know exactly what to do. When all the envelopes were sealed, I sat with them in my lap, a strange calm washing over me. Each one was a seed, and I had planted them with precision. I knew I wouldn't be there to watch them sprout. I wouldn't be at that wedding to see the confusion spread, the whispers start, the faces fall. But I didn't need to be, because by the time the wedding day came, the seeds I planted were already growing under their feet. On the morning of the wedding, I woke to silence. My house was still, the kind of stillness that makes every sound outside feel sharper. I knew what day it was. I knew where my daughter was at that very moment, sitting in a chair with her hair being curled, makeup brushed on her face, laughter bubbling around her, as if the world was perfect. She believed her day had come. But I also knew what was already moving beneath the surface, what had been set into motion by the envelopes I mailed just days earlier. I wasn't there, but I came to know the details in time. People talk. They always talk when a wedding crumbles. And what they described to me later painted a picture more vivid than if I had been standing in the room myself. The officiant had been the first to show strain. He walked into the chapel carrying not only his Bible, but an envelope tucked discreetly into his jacket. His words faltered as he rehearsed the order of the ceremony. He wasn't just thinking about vows and blessings. He was thinking about what he had read the night before, the license, the prenup, the whispers of another woman. Then there was Estelle. Proud, polished Estelle Whitford. They said she clutched a manila folder in her lap as guests filed in, her lips pressed tight, her usual cool composure cracking at the edges. Every so often she'd lean toward Conrad, hissing words too sharp to be mistaken for joy. Her eyes, usually sharp with control, darted toward Darien with something new, suspicion. And the maid of honor. They told me her face had lost its color. Her hands trembling as she held the bouquet meant for Talia. She had received her envelope, too. She had read every clause in that prenup, and it showed in the way she leaned into Talia's ear during the preparations, whispering warnings that the bride refused to hear. Talia waved her off, brushing away the nerves like lint on her dress. But the seed of doubt had been planted. It was there in the maid of honor's eyes, in the way her voice shook when she said, "Are you sure about this?" I imagined it all as I sat alone in my kitchen that day, the clock ticking, the light shifting across the floor. I wasn't in that chapel, but I didn't need to be. I knew the power of what I had unleashed. I pictured Talia walking down the aisle, smiling, oblivious to the storm swirling just behind her. Guests craned their necks to watch, some already whispering at the sight of Estelle's stony face, others noticing the officiant's unsteady hands as he opened his notes. Cracks were forming, thin at first, like hairline fractures in glass. But once a crack starts, it spreads. It can't be undone. And I knew it was only a matter of time before everything splintered. I sat back, folded my hands, and waited. And then, at the reception, everything blew apart. They say weddings are supposed to be about joy, about the union of two people becoming one. But what happened that day was the exact opposite. It wasn't unity, it was exposure. It wasn't joy, it was ruin. The first blow came from the maid of honor. She pulled Talia aside, bouquet still trembling in her hands, and whispered too loudly for the room to ignore. "Did you even read what you signed?" Gasps spread as curious eyes turned toward them. Talia's face drained of color, and she shook her head, trying to hush her friend. But the maid of honor wasn't finished. She pulled a folded copy of the prenup from her clutch, pressing it into Talia's hand. "He's locked you into nothing. 5 years, Talia. 5 years, and you walk away with nothing." The second blow landed almost immediately. Estelle, with that manila folder still clenched tight, cornered her son near the head table. Guests caught glimpses of her waving the bank statements in his face, her lips pulled into a thin, furious line. Conrad stood beside her, his jaw rigid, while Darien tried to brush it off with that arrogant smirk of his. But the numbers didn't lie. His own mother knew now, knew about the other woman he'd been supporting in secret. The sight of Estelle's composure cracking was enough to send whispers buzzing across every table. And then came the final blow. The doors to the reception hall opened, and in walked a woman no one expected. She wasn't dressed like a guest. She wasn't dressed like she belonged. She stormed into that room with fire in her eyes, clutching photographs in her hand. The ex-lover, the one Darien had been paying all along. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked straight to the dance floor, lifted the photos, and shouted, "Ask him why he was in my bed 6 months ago. Ask him why he promised me the same vows he just gave her." The room erupted. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward in fascination. Phones came out, recording, snapping, documenting every second. The dream Talia had built, the image she thought she could perfect, crumbled right there in front of everyone. Her dress suddenly looked heavy, her makeup like a mask sliding off her face. Darien tried to control it, tried to laugh it off, but the maid of honor had already unleashed the prenup. Estelle had already hissed about the bank transfers. And now the ex-lover was waving photographs like evidence in a courtroom. The perfect day was gone. The whispers turned to open conversation. "Did you hear? He was already married. She signed a prenup? There's another woman?" Talia stood frozen, her eyes darting from Darien to her mother-in-law to the woman with the photographs. Everything she thought she had, everything she thought she had chosen over me, collapsed in one brutal sweep. And as I sat at home, Picturing the scene unfolding in real time, I knew one thing for certain. My revenge had landed. But the Whitfords weren't done. No, humiliation wasn't something they swallowed easily. They were going to try to bury the scandal another way. The thing about powerful families like the Whitfords is that they don't lose gracefully. They don't accept humiliation, and they don't allow cracks in their perfect image without a fight. That wedding reception may have ended in chaos, but the very next morning, Conrad and Estelle were already moving pieces, trying to rewrite the story. They began with spin. According to them, the whole disaster hadn't been Darienne's fault at all. No, it was Talia. Their narrative was that she had orchestrated the confrontation, that she had been aware of the prenup, that she had staged the ex-lover's arrival to humiliate their son. In their version of events, she was the schemer, the manipulator, the embarrassment. It was easier for them to turn their anger toward her than to face the truth about Darien. Darien himself was no better. He put on that smirk of his, the one that made me sick, and threatened lawsuits, defamation, emotional distress. He said he would drag Talia into court if she dared to make any of it public. He insisted the bank transfers were loans, that the marriage license had been an error, that the photographs were taken out of context. But his words couldn't erase the whispers, because whispers had already turned into chatter. The vendors who worked the wedding, the caterers, the photographers, the staff, all saw what happened. And when vendors talk, word spreads fast. By the end of that week, murmurs of "Did you hear about the Whitford wedding?" were bouncing between circles that Conrad and Estelle couldn't control. Guests leaked details to their friends. And though the Whitfords tried to buy silence with money and legal threats, the humiliation only deepened. Talia was caught in the middle. She tried to hold on, tried to insist that things could still be salvaged. But everywhere she turned, there were stares, pitying looks, whispered laughter behind her back. She was no longer the bride glowing in white. She was the woman who had signed away her future to a man who betrayed her before she even walked down the aisle. And while the Whitfords wove their lies, I sat quietly in my house. I didn't need to defend myself. I didn't need to shout from the rooftops. I had done what I came to do. I had exposed the truth, and it had already begun to burn. But I wasn't prepared for what came next, because in the middle of all that noise, the spin, the lawsuits, the gossip, my daughter, the same one who had called me an embarrassment, the same one who banned me from her wedding, came back knocking on my door. It was late in the evening when I heard the knock. Soft at first, then harder, as if the person on the other side feared I wouldn't answer. I knew that rhythm. I had known it since she was a child, since she used to come home past curfew and knock in that same uneasy way. My heart pounded because I already knew who it was before I opened the door. There stood Talia, my daughter, but not the glowing bride she had imagined herself to be. Not the woman who had dismissed me as an embarrassment. She was stripped bare of all that. Her makeup was gone, her eyes swollen from crying, her dress replaced by wrinkled clothes she must have thrown on in haste. She looked smaller, like the girl I used to hold after nightmares. Only this nightmare was one she had created herself. Mom, her voice cracked. She hadn't called me that in months. For so long, I had been Marvette, or her never Mom. The sound of it was almost enough to break me. Almost. She stepped inside before I could even respond, clutching her phone like it was the last thing tethering her to the world. She paced my living room, words tumbling out of her mouth faster than she could catch them. She spoke about Darien threatening lawsuits, about the Whitfords turning the story against her, about the whispers and the stares and the humiliation she couldn't escape. And then her eyes locked on mine, pleading, "Please, you have to help me. You have to fix this. If you testify, if you tell them what really happened, maybe I can salvage something. Maybe I can walk away without being destroyed." I watched her collapse onto my couch, her hands gripping at her knees, her whole body shaking. She wasn't the same daughter who had looked at me with disdain. That woman was gone. What sat in front of me now was desperation, pure and unfiltered. She begged me over and over. Her words stumbled into sobs. She asked me to stand beside her in court to defend her against the lies Darien and his parents were spinning. She asked me to tell the world that she wasn't the schemer they painted her to be. I sat across from her, quiet. I wanted to hold her, the way I used to when she was a child. But another part of me remembered. I remembered the phone call. I remembered the sting of being told I embarrassed her. I remembered all the times she had looked at me like I was less than, like I was the weight holding her back. Now she wanted me to be the shield she had stripped away. The silence between us stretched long. She cried harder, waiting for my answer, waiting for me to say yes, waiting for me to rescue her from the mess she had walked into. Finally, I leaned forward, my voice steady, my eyes locked on hers. And I told her I would appear in court, but only to tell the truth. The courthouse smelled of wood polish and old paper, the kind of place where truth and lies wrestle under the sharp gaze of judges. I sat there in the front row, my hands folded neatly in my lap, the packet of documents resting in the custody of attorneys who would soon make their cases. I wasn't nervous. Not anymore. I had already lived through my worst humiliation. What could they do to me now? Darien strutted in first, his suit pressed sharp, his smirk plastered on like armor. His parents followed. Conrad stoic, Estelle composed but tight around the eyes. And then came Talia, my daughter, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. She avoided my gaze as she took her seat, her hands clenching the sides of her skirt. I wanted to reach for her, but I stayed still. This was not the time for reaching. This was the time for reckoning. The attorneys began with evidence. The prenup was introduced first. The judge flipped through it slowly, his brow furrowing as he read the clauses aloud. 5 years. Nothing if she left before then. Gasps rippled through the room. You could almost feel the weight pressing down on Talia as she sat there, realizing everyone now knew the trap she had signed herself into. Next came the prior marriage license. Stamped, dated, filed just 6 months before Darien proposed to my daughter. The room shifted uncomfortably, murmurs breaking out until the judge slammed his gavel for silence. Darien's attorney scrambled, calling it an administrative error, but the paper spoke for itself. Then the bank transfers, neat rows of dates and amounts, each one sent to the same woman month after month. When the ex-lover was called to confirm, she didn't flinch. She testified to the promises he made her, the support he gave, the betrayal she endured. Darien's face reddened, but he still tried to laugh it off, shaking his head like it was all a joke. But jokes don't hold up under evidence. And evidence was all over those tables. Finally, it was my turn. I walked to the witness stand, my steps steady, my chin lifted. I took the oath, my hand firm as I promised to tell the truth. And then I sat down, facing the courtroom, facing Darien, facing my daughter. They asked me what I knew, and I told them plainly. I told them how the envelope had landed in my mailbox, how I had opened it, what I had found inside. I didn't embellish. I didn't soften. I laid it out the way it happened. The prenup, the prior license, the bank transfers, the photographs. Darienne's attorney tried to rattle me, asking if I had a personal vendetta, if I had a reason to sabotage my daughter's wedding. I looked him straight in the eye and gave my answer, not to him, but to the room, to my daughter, to Darien himself. I didn't ruin your wedding, I said, my voice firm enough to silence every shuffle of paper in that courtroom. You ruined me long before it. The words hung in the air like a bell ringing after the hour. No one moved. No one coughed. Even the judge leaned back in his chair, studying me quietly as though weighing the depth of what I had just said. And then I saw it, the flicker of skepticism in his eyes as he turned back to Darienne's side. The kind of look a judge gives when the scales are tipping, when the lies are no longer enough to cover the truth. The silence that followed was louder than any gavel. When the hearings ended, the Whitfords slinked back into their glass house of wealth and denial, and Darien walked out of that courtroom with his smirk cracked and his reputation bleeding. But my daughter, my Talia, she walked out with nothing but silence trailing behind her. Her world collapsed in slow motion. The friends she once bragged about, they stopped calling. Invitations dried up. Bridesmaids, who had once posed beside her in glossy dresses, now avoided her in grocery aisles. No one wanted to be tied to the woman whose wedding had become a scandal whispered about at dinner tables. Work didn't save her either. Employers side-eyed her name. Whispers following her resume wherever it landed. People wanted to distance themselves from the shame, from the spectacle. Even those who stayed polite carried that look in their eyes, that faint shadow of pity mixed with judgment. And Talia could feel it. She had chased belonging all her life, but now she belonged nowhere. Her reputation wasn't the only thing shattered. Her future dimmed with every passing week. Darienne's threats of lawsuits lingered, and though his case was crumbling, the rumors of litigation made her untouchable. Every move she tried to make was blocked by the shadow of his lies. She had signed her life away with that prenup, and even though the marriage itself was poisoned from the start, the stain of it clung to her. And in the middle of her ruin, something shifted in the way she looked at me. The theft story, the one she had carried like a sword against me, the one she had used to justify her rejection, no longer sat the same way in her mind. I saw it in her eyes the day she came to me, hollow and defeated. She spoke softly, almost to herself. You were hungry, weren't you? You were just trying to survive. For the first time, she didn't say it with disgust. She said it with understanding. But understanding, when it comes too late, is just another kind of punishment. I listened to her, but I didn't answer right away, because part of me wanted to shake her, to remind her of the years she let that single mistake define me, to remind her of the night she told me I embarrassed her. But another part of me, the mother still buried beneath the scars, could only look at her and see a woman finally facing the consequences of choosing everyone else's approval over her own blood. One evening, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands fidgeting, her eyes wet with exhaustion. Mom, she whispered, do you still have the original packet? Her voice cracked on the word Mom, as if saying it carried both shame and desperation. I didn't answer right away. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Please, I need it. I need to face him. I need to show him I'm not afraid anymore. Her request hung between us like a storm cloud. She wanted the very thing I had used to dismantle her world, the very evidence that had destroyed her dream. She thought it might give her back some piece of control, some weapon to carry into the last confrontation with Darien. And I sat there, silent, staring at her, because in that moment, I realized the choice wasn't about Darien at all. It was about her. For years, Conrad and Estelle Whitford had lived like their last name was a crown. They walked into rooms expecting people to part. They carried themselves as though money could silence every whisper and patch every crack. And for a long time, it worked. But money, I've learned, is only as strong as the lies it covers. And when the lies spill out in broad daylight, wealth turns from a shield into a spotlight. At first, they tried to act untouched. They leaned on their lawyers, issued statements through their circle, pretended the scandal at the wedding was nothing more than personal matters exaggerated. But their walls were already shaking. The ex-lover didn't fade into the background like they hoped. She pressed her claims, loudly, firmly, with her own documentation to back her up. And no amount of polished Whitford denial could erase the proof of monthly transfers and broken promises. Then came the social circles. Estelle, who once prided herself on hosting luncheons and attending charity galas, began to notice the smallest shifts. Invitations stopped arriving. Her calls weren't returned. Friends she had dined with for years suddenly had conflicting schedules. In that world, reputation is currency, and once you're tainted, no one wants your touch on their name. She found herself cornered in her own living room, watching her social empire slip through her manicured fingers. Conrad's fall was quieter, but sharper. He had always been the one to control the narrative, the businessman who commanded respect with his voice alone. But Darienne's disgrace bled into his credibility. Partners began to question his judgment. Boardrooms that once hung on his every word now sat stiff, waiting, suspicious. I heard he was forced to step back from one of his prized positions, temporarily, though everyone knew it was permanent. And then there was Darien, their golden boy, their heir, the man they had believed would carry their legacy. Conrad began to distance himself, no longer walking into rooms with his son at his side, no longer defending him with the same fire. Estelle, too, stopped speaking of him with pride, her once adoring tone replaced by silence. It was as if they thought by cutting him loose, they could salvage what remained of their name. But the truth was simpler. Their empire had already cracked from within. They had built their power on the illusion of perfection. And once that illusion shattered, the pieces cut them deeper than they ever imagined. In the middle of their unraveling, a new offer slid across the table. A settlement. Money meant to hush, meant to bind, meant to buy a silence that their son's arrogance could no longer demand. It was the Whitfords' last weapon, their last attempt to keep the ashes of their reputation from blowing into the wind. But when the offer reached Talia's hands, she stared at it with eyes that no longer burned for their approval. She pushed it back across the table and whispered the first act of defiance I had ever seen in her. She refused. The day I decided to hand the original envelope back to Talia, I didn't make an announcement. I didn't call her over in anger. or prepare a speech. I simply placed the packet on the table between us. It was sealed again, neat and heavy in her hands, just as it had been the day I first pulled it from my mailbox. For a moment, she just stared at it. Her fingers brushed the edge of the envelope, like she wasn't sure whether to open it or leave it closed forever. I watched her eyes flicker, recognition, shame, a faint spark of defiance that hadn't yet died. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. She knew what it was. She knew what it had done. That envelope had been the key that unlocked the truth, the wedge that pried open the perfect world she thought she was stepping into. And now it was hers to carry, not mine, because my part was done. I had carried humiliation in silence when she told me I embarrassed her. I had lived through the weight of a mistake I made decades ago, watching it stain how she saw me. But this was different. This wasn't about shame or whispers anymore. This was about dignity, about standing tall, not because the world suddenly respected me, but because I had chosen to respect myself. While she sifted through the ashes of her life, I began piecing mine back together. Quiet mornings became peaceful again. I cooked meals in a kitchen no longer filled with bitterness. I tended to the small things, my books, my garden, the rhythm of my days. It wasn't the life of grandeur the Whitfords boasted about, but it was mine. And it was honest. Talia struggled in those months. She carried her disgrace like a shadow that followed her everywhere. But this time, it wasn't my burden to lift. She had to live with the consequences of her choices, just as I had once lived with mine. I gave her the envelope not as a gift, not as a weapon, but as a mirror, a reminder that the truth will always find its way to the surface. And as I sit here now, telling you this story, I keep circling back to the beginning. The phone call, the words that cut me so deeply I thought I might never heal from them. You embarrass me. You're not coming to my wedding. She banned me from her wedding because I embarrassed her. But the truth is, the thing that arrived in my mailbox embarrassed her far more than I ever could.